Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shortgen. I'm here with London Paul. And Paul, an interesting thing has suddenly cropped up, a similarity, a parallel to something of the past. Approximately, 60 years ago, there was an event that ended up being called the Bay of Pigs. Now, the Bay of Pigs was supposed to be an invasion of Cuban nationals in America with the support of the Pentagon, air support, to retake Cuba. And inevitably, President Kennedy had told the Pentagon to provide that air support, but just before the attack happened, someone in his administration went to the Pentagon and overruled him. So there was no air support, and the Bay of Pigs was a fiasco. Fast forward now to 2024. And it appears that the president, the Biden or Joe Biden, did not have any knowledge of this sudden change in policy going on in Ukraine about using longer range weapons. And we're going to delve a little bit into that. And Paul, want to thank you as always for being a part of the discussion. And boy, does history sure rhymes.
Yeah. Well, obviously, thank you for joining as well, Ken. As it's always a pleasure as ever. So, yeah, we thought this was an interesting discussion point because it pulls together quite a few strands, and they're all in some way, shape, or form interconnected. So, and the historical reference you make, Ken, beautifully and eloquently highlights precisely this point. Now, there's absolutely no doubt that it wasn't Biden who authorized these obviously these missile strikes on Russian territory with, in this case, ATACMS. It also transpires for Storm Shadow missiles that the British would have to get permission from the Americans to do so as well, which is why the Britain, for some very peculiar reason, has spent many, many months begging the Americans to let them use these weapons, and the Pentagon and the intelligence agencies went, no chance, you're not doing them, because this could lead to a huge escalation that we have no control over. We have no idea what the Russian response might be. You know, they've got hypersonic weapons, as we've said on several occasions previously, and we have no answer to them. So the answer is no. Now, suddenly, of course, we have the presidential election. Trump wins, and everybody knows that Trump's attitude is going to be, well, okay, he's not going to end the war in 24 hours, but I want to end the war. And he wants to be seen to be the guy who ends it because it's great, you know, political kudos. He looks very presidential if he can do it. I'm not suggesting he'll do it, but the one thing he's certainly not going to do is say, well, let's escalate this war and allow the Americans or the British or anyone else to use these longer range weapons and fire them into what they regard to be the Russian Federation. Okay, there is the argument from the West's point of view that Crimea belongs to Ukraine, so it's Ukrainian soil, but you get the point. So the question then is, who gave the decision? Because the truth of the matter is, and I can say this, nobody has a clue. Nobody actually knows who made the decision, who told whoever in Ukraine they had permission to do so, whoever was operating these ATACMS. Now, most people just assume it's the Americans, and it probably is, but it might not be. It could have just been the Ukrainians, as we've highlighted previously. But it really comes back to the point, why would they do it, and who's responsible? And if nobody knows who's responsible, then effectively that means there's a loose cannon walking around inside this, what's left of the Biden administration, which frankly, this is why you don't have transition governments. It's idiotic, particularly given Trump was going to have a very different perspective on Ukraine than the Biden administration. There was always the risk that they go, well, we've got 60 days, whatever, let's throw the kitchen sink at this. Or someone thinks we're going to throw the kitchen sink at this. But there's an argument that says it's highly unlikely that suddenly the Pentagon are going to go, well, yes, you've got authorization after saying for many, many months, no, that's not happening. The argument, though, people say is, well, the Pentagon are responsible for these ATACMS, so they would have to have, well, at least someone would have to have given someone in the Pentagon the authorization or said, you have to allow these weapons to now be utilized, because the argument from most people's perspective is the Pentagon controls these ATACMS, and they're the ones who are responsible for firing them or providing targeting data, etc., etc. Okay, there's some logic to that, but why the sudden shift from the Pentagon's perspective? That seems less likely. I don't think the intelligence agencies are going to do it for the very same reason they were extremely reluctant to do so. The only entities really pushing to do this was inside the Biden administration itself, but that is a vast network. It could be anyone. It might not, of course, be anybody inside the administration, but there's someone somewhere who had the authority to override the president of the United States, as he still is, Biden, and make that decision. And that is extremely concerning when you have a loose cannon who can make those decisions, that decisions implemented. And, and therefore we've also, there are concerns about, and we'll come on to that shortly when you spoke, Ken, about there may be other things they want to escalate with. And literally it's part of this idea, someone in the administration or someone who can move the levers of power on behalf of the administration wants to throw the kitchen sink before Trump is inaugurated. What's it, the 20th of January?
It's kind of interesting because when you and I were on a different platform and different podcast, it was the night and during the Trump administration that he ended up bombing Syria. And we had thrown out the speculation because France had actually been pushing for it, and the escalation might have been even greater. So maybe Trump was forced into a situation where he had to put some type of demonstration bombing Syria to de-escalate the what was going on. And it goes back to what I said. The Trump foreign policy was always escalate to de-escalate. Now, with that being said, during the Trump administration, they tried to form partnerships or at least alliances or, make friends with North Korea. Some historic things were done there with Russia, with China, etc. But look at all the poison pills within his administration. Not necessarily naming names, but there was one individual who hampered and really put a wedge into increasing what was going on between the U.S. and North Korea. There was one individual who admitted that he didn't tell the president that he had a back channel with China in order to keep the president in the dark. And then, of course, take a look at what we have here. The majority of individuals within the Biden administration are members of the former Obama administration. And we know that Barack Obama really didn't run too much himself. He was just a figurehead. And so are those individuals running the show and doing what they want to do? We have what's going on, of course, with certain entities within NATO and Europe. Britain just made a defense pact agreement with Moldova. And then, of course, there's this coming up in one of the mainstream media things. 12 European nations have formed a coalition to prevent Trump from forcing Ukraine and Putin to negotiate a peace deal. There are so many entities that do not want this conflict, or at least the revelation of what's going on in Ukraine, probably going back a few decades, to be revealed, and they're going to stop it at all costs.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There are so many moving parts to this, and coming back to this, originally there was a story in the US mainstream media that there was going to be permission given to use ATACMS. there was no statement from the White House. The statement was clearly a leak. Someone leaked it, but they leaked it because, and I would suspect, and I don't know that for definite, that whoever leaked it was the one who intended to implement this strike policy with the ATACMS on Russian soil. There was subsequently claims, I think, that there was some story in the US mainstream media again, and that there was some consideration being given to giving now Ukraine nuclear weapons. I would take that with an enormous dose of salt. I think that is just not going to happen, but that could be just to say, well, there was a leak talking about ATACMS and it happened. And I think this is trying to massively provoke a huge reaction from the Russians. So then Trump could never end the war. The war would have to carry on for the reasons and you've just highlighted, Ken. So I think that's the rationale for now, because there's no way anyone's going to take that kind of measure. I mean, there's taking risks and deciding to try and escalate or a war to the point that you can keep the war going longer on some premise. But the idea you would just give Ukraine those kind of weapons, I mean, that just is not going to happen. So, because I think if anyone tried to do that and then started trying to ship them, I think you would have the biggest constitutional crisis in the history of the United States, frankly. So I think that was just someone's trying to provoke Putin into making an overreaction to go, see, we have to carry on this war. Now, obviously, there is the other angle that the Biden administration or someone in it is trying to throw a spanner in the works to set Trump's presidency off on the wrong footing, and he basically nullify him having any opportunity to end the war. So the question is, why are all these individuals or nations, why don't they want the war to end? And there are a number of obvious reasons to this. I mean, we're not getting into names again, but everybody knows there's an enormous black hole of money that went into Ukraine and can't be accounted for. That where it's gone, no one knows. There's no doubt there's a bunch of people in the Ukraine who've stolen some of it. But also I think it's fair to say that there are certainly interests from the West inside Ukraine that have been for quite a long period of time. And there is certainly some suggestions and evidence to support the view that corruption inside Ukraine isn't just limited to Ukrainians. So who else is being with their hand in the proverbial cookie jar? And is the fear in a broader sense that if the war ends, that all dirty business that's gone on in Ukraine will end up in the public domain, and some people could be in serious hot water? You have to consider that to be a possibility. You also have to consider that for some entities, if the war ends politically, their career's over because they've invested so much political capital, money. You know, look at Germany. I mean, Germany's been destroyed because of Nord Stream being blown up and not having access to cheap Russian energy. I mean, so there are domestic, economic, and financial considerations that have wrecked nations. So there are a lot of people who said, we've spent 2.5 years investing all this political capital. If the war ends, we're probably politically finished. And if they don't have a political career anymore, then what are they going to do? Nothing. Because they're not capable of doing anything else. So that's another consideration we have to think. The other point is it's not just personal, but the likelihood is that that NATO will cease to exist, as it does now, may cease to exist full stop, come the end of the Ukraine war because of their just enormous political fallout. And there might be a lot of vested interest who'll go, well, I don't want that to happen either, because we don't know what all the quid pro quos going on inside NATO could be. And what's the tie-ins with the military-industrial complex, etc. There's so many variables here, but there's certainly an awful lot of very, very terrified people in the West about why this war could end. There's some of the reasons, I'm sure, There are many other less obvious reasons, but clearly they're extremely nervous about the prospect of this. And when you make the point, Ken, about the British signing some military agreement with Moldova, well, we talked about Moldova before. This is why we talk about these places, because they're extremely important, not least because Moldova has borders in part with Ukraine, but also there's that thin strip of land, Transnistria, which has Russian peacekeeping forces on it. It also has the biggest military arsenal in Europe, at least. It's enormous. It's a hangover from the sort of Soviet era. And someone might like to get their hands on that. There's a risk, as we said before, that some conflict could spill over into Transnistria, and that would be a way of getting Russia either directly involved, which it would do, and therefore that might skew in some people's minds the war in favor of Ukraine, which it's absolutely not going to do, because all of this is desperation. The desperation to believe that the war can continue, that Ukraine will prevail, which it won't. And you have to say as well, in part, that these actions being taken not only might derail Trump, but the argument is that some might think, well, if there's a massive escalation, I don't understand the American Constitution well enough, but if this was to escalate into a far bigger conflict, I don't so much believe sucking Europe in and NATO into a world war, but is there any chance that something could happen that might prevent Trump assuming the presidency on the 20th of January? I don't know, possibly. Don't want to sound too conspiratorial either, because we're just throwing an idea. I'm not saying it's going to happen. But when people are desperate, they can do very silly things and think that they can somehow engineer an outcome which they're not going to achieve. But without any shadow of a doubt, there's some entities inside Washington walking around making decisions they have no right to make. I don't think a transition government should have any say in anything other than domestic policy. Any international policy would have to be an agreement between a transition government and the next government. And that's clearly not happening, and why this transition in US politics has to end. Although it's not going to happen, but it should do. But whoever is running around, or what group of people or two people, whatever, making decisions like this are extremely dangerous, because we don't know how desperate they are or why they're desperate. They may have some personal reasons to be desperate about this, or it might be a general, broader fear that, and there is a lot of people in the West who think if Russia wins this war, it's the end of the West. The West's finished. It's the nail in the coffin lid for the West, because then we will look weak, and then maybe Putin will come after us and invade our country, which of course he's not going to, but there's a lot of ideological brainwashing going on. But this is extremely concerning, because if you have a loose cannon in an administration that's on its way out, who really might feel they've got nothing to lose, we don't know what they might be prepared to do. And despite the fact there's been this Russian response, as we said in a recent podcast, that might not deter some people, depending on how desperate they are, to either see the war continue or to do, in some way, shape, or form, or just to do everything to prevent Trump just saying enough's enough and I want the war to end.
Yeah, it's a very great point in regards to the Constitution. Well, during the Civil War, President Lincoln summarily just removed the right of habeas corpus. We've seen under the NDAA that they can, under the guise of war on terrorism, which is not an official war, they can arrest somebody without charges and no access to lawyers. So honestly, anything is possible. The problem, and I do believe this is the saving grace, is that Trump's election was such a landslide that, I mean, if it was just close and close, maybe they think half of America would allow it to happen. But they learned during the pandemic, you and I have talked about these things. From your side of it, like they would never implement it. Well, they would implement it if they could get away with it. And that's exactly the same philosophy they would do is I think they would try to get rid of Biden, promote Kamala from the vice president to the president under the 25th Amendment, and then declare a martial law for whatever reason. That's been spouted in the mainstream media. And many times you see these things that these outrageous stories in the mainstream media, they're, they're putting them out there to see what the response is going to be. And obviously, if there's a lot of uh, blowback, then it's just, oh, well, liberals being liberals. But in a lot of cases, they throw these things out there to see what the response is, to see if they can get away with it. Now, the most important thing to remember is Ukraine is not simply, this isn't a war against, stand up to Russian aggression. The moment that Trump started looking into Ukraine, all of a sudden he gets impeached. Impeachment things come up. There have been politicians who, it's common knowledge, have financial ties to Ukraine. Who knows what else has been going on there? So Ukraine is important for much, 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 much more than just standing up to the aggression of Russia. And when you take a look at it, the biggest fear I think they have is not only is this expectation of going through and auditing the entire federal government under the Doge agency, but also Trump's focus is going to be primarily on China. And he's partially being dragged into what's going on in the Middle East, Israel, Iran, things like that. But he wants to focus on China. So he can't really have, you know, he had to deal with Afghanistan while he was there. He had to deal with Syria. He had to deal with this and this and this and this. He wants to deal with one thing at a time. So as long as they can keep Ukraine going, it keeps him from focusing on the things that might actually make some change and bring about, an end to this continuous war hegemony that the U.S. has become.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see just in this discussion, as brief in reality as it is, just why just saying, well, Biden wasn't responsible, so what? I mean, someone was, but there are enormous ramifications. And as you say, there are clear indications or interests inside Europe that, well, if Trump walks away from the war, we want to continue it. I mean, they haven't got any capability to do so whatsoever. They don't have, I mean, Europe's bankrupt. It doesn't have any military hardware to give. It isn't capable of producing the military hardware required. I mean, it's just a complete dead loss even trying to consider doing this. But the mere fact they are suggests that there are potentially, as we said, personal reasons, political reasons, broader reasons about the future of NATO, and just general fear that the West is finished if Russia wins the war. But whatever it is, there's some overriding reasons why there's this desire to keep this war going and support Ukraine come what may. But ultimately, it's completely futile. But in the process of having these situations in play, people can make idiotic choices. And again, I'm not suggesting we're going to go have World War III or anything. Absolutely not. But I'm saying they could make decisions that could spark a reaction from the Russians that Ukraine particularly would rather not see. And don't keep having this idea, well, Putin won't use this weapon, Putin won't do this. Just, to coin that phrase, don't poke the bear. And there comes a point that if you push Putin too far, he may do something you wouldn't wish to happen or you wouldn't expect to happen. Don't assume that the Russians have an endless supply of patience, which is what they have had. It's not weakness. It's just a desire not to see this escalate. Because at the end of the day, whatever we think, and this may sound ridiculous, they regard the Ukrainians predominantly as brothers. I mean, and that's why from their perspective, they don't want to kill lots of innocent civilians. So, they're going to have very mixed feelings about the progress of this war, and I'm sure they don't want to escalate it any further themselves, but just don't push them into a position based on what Putin recently said that they may take a course of action which could potentially, for example, say we don't want a special military operation anymore. We're going to declare war. And if they declare war, then all bets are off as to what they might do. And we have to obviously hope, well, just hope against hope that, in fact, that never transpires.
Absolutely. Paul, want to thank you as always for being a part of this great discussion. I think it's a vastly important one because it gets into the details of really, in the end, what Ukraine has been all about, rather than the surface about, oh, Russia's anti-aggression. Um, Also, to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you for for your support as well. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, comment, send this out to anybody you think would be important. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.